Welcome to another STARS webinar. I am David Orn, Director of Programs and Communication at STARS. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you. Today we talk with Dr. Michael Barbalas about how foreign companies can be successful in China in 2021. Mike is a Beijing-based speaker, board member, and consultant. He is a senior consultant at PRI and a member of the National Committee on U.S. China relations. Among other positions, Mike previously served as president of the American Chamber of Commerce in China and as vice president of China programs for UTC Aerospace Systems. Mike holds a PhD in chemistry from Cornell University. He reads and speaks Chinese, and he was one of the very first foreigners to be granted China permanent residence status. Good afternoon to you, Mike. Good to see you, and thank you for speaking in today's webinar.
Thanks, David. It's great to see you. It's a nice spring day here in Beijing. Thanks for the invitation, and I look forward. I always enjoy the STARS community because of the depth and thoughtfulness of the questions and discussion, and I hope we can provide some helpful perspectives today.
Fantastic. We now have 30 minutes to discuss with Mike. I will take the privilege to ask the first couple of questions. In the meantime, if you have any questions for Mike, please use the Q&A feature below to type in your question. Without any further ado, let's get right into it. And I would like to start with the big picture. Not least due to ongoing U.S.-China tensions, doing business in and with China has become more challenging for foreign companies over the last couple of years. What impact do you expect the Biden administration to have on the business environment for foreign companies in China?
Recently, AmCham China published its business climate survey. And unsurprisingly, maybe 98% of the respondents said that these bilateral relations between the U.S. and China are one of their biggest concerns. One of the things I think you're seeing already in the first 2 months is this is not a continuation of the Trump administration's policies. It's also not a return to Obama 2.0, even though many of the senior officials in the Biden administration served under President Obama. It's something new, but so far, you don't see any relaxation of the Trump era restrictions and actions. And it's quite a large overhang. If you look at all the measures against China over the last 4 years, tariffs, technology bans, visa restrictions, Taiwan policy changes, just in the last year of the Trump administration, there were over 200 public actions against China that spanned 10 different government departments. So the first 2 months, none of those have been changed, none of those have been removed, and President Biden's actually added some new ones just before the meetings in Alaska. 2 days before, there were sanctions against 24 people regarding issues in Hong Kong. So what we're seeing here, I think, is also the Biden administration focusing a lot on U.S. domestic issues, particularly the pandemic, and then beginning to reach out to allies and partners around the world.
So what do you see as the biggest challenges and opportunities for foreign companies in China in this year?
I think companies are looking at China's growth. If you look at last year, out of the top 30 economies in the world, China was the only one to grow. If you look at the next 5 years, economists are projecting China is going to contribute 1/3 of total global growth during that time period. That's the same as they're expecting from the US and Europe and Japan combined. That's the opportunity that companies are looking at, is that economic growth. Companies also feel that China is going to continue to open up its markets.
Taking into account these challenges and opportunities, what advice would you give to foreign companies to be successful in China in 2021?
Along with my colleagues here at PRI, we actually asked this question on behalf of our clients and customers early in the year. And what should they do and why should they do it? The why question was the easy one, the growth potential in China.
Right.
The what really became a series of steps that we felt were really critical and should be done right away, starting with reevaluating and realigning their strategy to the new normal.
Do you want to add on that? I think we have some time.
Altogether, we put together a white paper, and David, I think you'll be sending out the link to that afterwards to everyone. We said there's really 6 steps. So the first was realigning the strategy to the new normal. The second was to analyze and improve your supply chain. A third was to look at corporate restructuring options. This is maybe a once in a decade opportunity to do some of these. The fourth and the fifth went together. So the fourth was adding engineering and design capabilities here in China, and then expanding China domestic sales, and finally optimizing your team and HR strategy in China.
We already have a couple of questions from the audience. I'd like to open up the discussion already. Let's take the first two questions from Doris Albiser. She's the executive chairman of EvaluGlobe. Her first question: how does the professional services sector, apart from banking and insurance, develop in China in the near future?
Yeah, I think there's still, for example, if you look at U.S. China, U.S. actually runs a surplus in services with China. So there's quite a lot of opportunities for service companies as Chinese companies continue to try to move up the value chain. Chinese companies are trying to go global. If you look at the history of any multinational company, they all started off as a national company and then became an international company and eventually multinational. And many Chinese companies are going through that transition and are looking for companies that can provide help to them in strategy, in marketing and branding along that way. So I think there's a big opportunity for companies that can provide those kind of services.
The second question from Doris is about cross-border transactions. What is the appetite for cross-border transactions from a Chinese perspective?
I think that's really first tied to what happens with the pandemic and vaccinations around the world. Travel, right now, the biggest limitation is travel. I think you saw, over the last decade, a lot of outbound Chinese investment. Chinese companies still want to go global. As China pushes the Belt and Road Initiative, naturally, you'll see Chinese companies looking abroad outside of China for opportunities. And there's still quite a bit of capital available for Chinese companies to expand overseas. I think the immediate hurdle is the pandemic travel restrictions. But once those start to loosen up, the other challenge right now is some of the bilateral relations are difficult. It's not just the U.S. and China, China and Australia. So there's other markets where Chinese companies are reluctant to take big risk right now until some of these become clearer.
We have another question from Starsalang's Urs Brütsch. He's the owner of UB Services. He writes, China is big and powerful. To what extent must foreign companies subordinate to China's dictates? What are the basic requirements to be able to represent one's interests on a level playing field?
I think the first part of that is really complying with laws and regulations. China, just like, for example, companies operating in Europe have to really take note of the GDPR requirements for data privacy. China also has a whole set of requirements for internet security, for internet content. Even drawing a map in China and it leaves out Taiwan is not allowed. So you have to take all this into account. But I think for companies, that's really a minor part of their doing business. It's just following the laws and regulations and the norms and customs of the country.
If I may push you a little bit more on this topic, I just saw a headline this morning in the Financial Times. And let me quote, the headline was, H&M and Nike face China backlash over Xinjiang stance. State media and consumers attack clothing groups over statements on forced labor. What's your assessment of that, and what would be your advice for foreign companies, how to deal with Xinjiang?
Yeah, I think China has, in its international relations, had what it calls red lines, and Xinjiang is one of the red lines, and it's become very politicized right now. I think every company really has to, make its own decision where they stand. Again, for our company, PRI, we're a very values-focused company, and we don't want to be involved in questionable places anywhere in the world, anywhere in China, anywhere in the world. So I think each company really has to evaluate that on their own.
We have a question from the audience that directly ties into this discussion. The question comes from Salman Bokhari. He's the managing director of Sidratex, based in Basel. He writes, As China progresses economically, we are likely to see an increase in Chinese nationalism, also with respect to Chinese companies. This is also compounded by the fact that there is clearly an anti-China bias against Chinese economic expansion, with the possible exception of the push into Africa. Is it not time for Chinese companies to start a charm offensive to make countries more China-friendly?
That's a great question. I think if you look at some of China's actions in recent years, I think you really have to question, whether they've been helpful and productive for China. Some of what people characterize as wolf warrior diplomacy has obviously had some blowbacks and opposition in various places around the world. I think it really helps to look at China from, trying to understand how China sees itself and sees the world. I think China has gotten a lot more self-confident in the last 20 years. They've come through things like the Asian financial crisis, the global financial crisis. They survived a trade war with the U.S. for a couple of years and have come out of the pandemic pretty well so far. When they look at their own economic progress in the National People's Congress earlier this month, they celebrated getting to one of their 100-year goals, which is becoming a moderately prosperous society, a Xiaokang Shehui. They also achieved in 2020 the elimination of abject poverty in China. This was something they've been working on for almost 10 years. And at the start of COVID last year, people were saying, well, maybe we need to delay that. And the top leadership said, no, we committed to finish this in 2020, we're going to do it. And that was an amazing amount of work. So this is, over 40 years, China's lifted 750 million people out of poverty. That's 3/4 of the total people who've come out of poverty during that time. But they showed a tremendous amount of political will and targeted measures down to the province level, to the city level, to the county level, to the community level, down to the individual families, and making sure that they achieve that goal. So I think China has a lot to celebrate, but I think sometimes some of the attitudes, the nationalism, generates negative blowback and feedback around the world. China has a lot to be proud of, but sometimes going overboard on some of this doesn't help it. I mean, China has a lot to look forward to. In fact, in the news now, you'll often see a phrase, the rise of the East and the decline of the West. I'm sure the East is rising. I'm not entirely sure that the West is entirely declining, but China is on the rise. You see that economically, socially, many different ways.
Let me take one more question on this issue before we move on to other topics. The question comes from Nan Zhong. He's a product lead at Shopee in Singapore. He writes, do you think that the Western and Chinese governments would force businesses to take sides in controversial issues such as Xinjiang, Hong Kong, or Taiwan? How should businesses hedge these risks?
I think this is where every company, when they look at their strategy, really has to incorporate these political risks into that. I think more than forcing companies to take sides on particular political issues, you'll see technology-related choices that companies have to make. Particularly for the U.S., you may see bans on certain technologies or restrictions on certain technologies. And you've seen that going both ways, export from the U.S. and import into the U.S.
We have a comment and a question from Geoff Richards. He's the Executive Director of Research and Development at the AO Foundation. He writes, since China is not letting internationals back into China at present, unless they have their work contract there, including their wives, husbands, and children, and they're having a 2-week quarantine, irrespective of the visitor being vaccinated or not, when do you see China opening again to internationals?
This was actually a discussion at the National People's Congress, and there were varieties of opinion. I heard some dates maybe by September, but then others shortly afterwards were saying probably not before 2022. It's possible to get back into China. I just had a friend in Shanghai who came back recently from the United States. There is a 2-week quarantine, so it's a real problem for business where what used to be you decide you want to travel and you go to the airport. But I think it really depend on the rate at which vaccinations get done around the world. China right now has zero domestic transmission, domestic cases. The problem for China is everyone else, the United States, the UK, India, Brazil, other places around the world where COVID is very prevalent. China's goal is zero cases. And it's very difficult to maintain and still have a lot of international travel.
Josh's second part of the question is the other way around. What is your opinion on Chinese travel? Will Chinese be able to travel to Europe, for instance, later this year?
Europe, I'm not sure. It's relatively easy for them to travel to the U.S. The problem becomes getting back to China. You even see it in the price of the airline tickets. A one-way ticket going to the U.S. is pretty reasonable. Coming back is pretty unreasonable at this point. I'm hoping that one of the areas that, say, at least the U.S. and China, maybe China and the EU and other countries, will work on is really how do you mutually recognize vaccinations and how do you establish a safe and healthy protocol for people to travel internationally again.
I'd like to dig a little bit deeper into the 6 steps you mentioned earlier on. One of the points you mentioned is supply chain or restructuring of supply chains. So what trends do you see in the restructuring of supply chains of foreign companies?
I think first it starts with what is their strategy and what part does China play in that strategy. Some companies you will see dividing their global business into a China-centric and a non-China-centric part. And then you see the supply chain being very much focused on China for China. Some companies will have a China plus one strategy for Asia, where they develop dual sources, both in China and other places in Asia. But again, every company has to take a look at this. I think the pandemic this last year has made visible a lot of risks and potential problems in supply chains. Even a simple thing like one container ship stuck in the Suez Canal all of a sudden begins to show a lot of risk in very lean supply chains. So companies all over the world are looking at this. It's not just a China problem. It's really a global problem. But where does China fit in that global mix? I've seen some bad examples. I know of one company that moved some of their sourcing to India, but then all of their sub-suppliers were still in China. So they actually added cost, added time, but didn't actually reduce any China-related risks. So that's a negative example. But China's still a very competitive place to source and to manufacture. I talk to manufacturers that have operations in various parts of Asia and around the world. And China is still really hard to beat in terms of efficiency and supply chain.
More broadly, what trends do you see in restructuring of foreign companies' footprint in Asia? I mean, do you see investment in some areas, divestment in other areas, maybe?
Yeah, this varies all over depending on the industry and the particular company. This is actually a very, very good time if you have a need to restructure or a strategic opportunity to restructure, to actually carry that out. I mean, the last opportunity like this was probably the global financial crisis in 2008 to 2010. But we see some companies that are acquiring other companies in this environment. It's a good time to do a roll-up strategy. Other companies have been investing in China for decades and have a variety of joint ventures or wholly owned ventures in different parts of China, and they're taking the opportunity to reassess, what's the best for their business going forward, and then making the changes, whether they're closures or outsourcing or mergers or a whole variety of different activities. We also see a lot of PE firms being very active in China right now, and we've done some work for some of them and trying to evaluate opportunities.
What about research and development? Do you see foreign companies shifting more of their R&D to China or rather out of China? What is the trend?
I would say there's more R&D moving to China, and it's partly because earlier this month, China approved its 14th five-year plan and 2035 15-year plan. And both of those involve tremendous investment in innovation and technology development. And China's made a lot of progress in recent years. You can see things like the high-speed rail network, the work China's done on artificial intelligence or electric vehicles, their space program. There's a lot of technology development in China, and China has a huge pool of engineering talent. One of the things we've found is that the engineering talent in China is still cheaper than many other markets in the world. Also very productive if it's managed correctly. The other, for the US, one of the big advantages of China is while engineers are sleeping in the US, engineers are working in China, and you can set up a very good system where you can accelerate your technology development by basically working continuously on your product development. One of the issues that often comes up with this is intellectual property protection. And again, year after year, the AmCham studies show that intellectual property is still a concern, but the environment is getting better and better. And this is partly in China's own interest, that if you want to develop technology, if you want innovation, it has to be protected and rewarded. And China's been taking steps to do that.
China's 14 five-year plan, which you just mentioned, is also heavy on the new dual circulation strategy, which, as I understand, seeks to stimulate domestic consumption especially from China's rising middle class. What impact do you expect this dual circulation strategy to have on foreign companies in China?
I would encourage every foreign company to download and read the 14th five-year plan. I don't know too many countries in the world that publish a 5-year plan and a 15-year plan. Again, I would encourage you not to bet against China in accomplishing some of these. And the plan is pretty specific in some areas. For example, they're saying that productivity growth needs to exceed GDP growth, where they're trying to increase the productivity and the standard of living, and that's important. Some of them are very specific. For example, in the area of public health, there's a target in the 14th five-year plan that the number of medical personnel per 1,000 population is going to increase from 2.9 this year to 3.2 in 2025. So there's some very specific metrics in there. The dual circulation is focused on both the export markets, and you'll see China continues to develop those, but greatly increasing the domestic consumption. And China is known for at least a decade that key to their future economic success is developing domestic consumption. That's now really moved center stage in their planning and thinking and policies and execution. So this is what's driving that economic growth is the great rise of the middle class in China and the accompanying consumption that goes along with that.
What major regulatory changes do you expect in China in 2021? And do any of these regulatory changes target foreign companies in particular?
Right now, the biggest regulatory change is anti-monopoly directed at China's own IT companies and the protection of personal information. Every year in China, we have a day in March, which is the National Consumers Day, and a number of companies were called out for using facial recognition where they shouldn't have used it or weren't supposed to use it. So a lot of the regulatory issues right now are directed at Chinese companies and protecting commercial use of individual information. That's the biggest issue right now. Generally, China is trying to open up financial markets. They're trying to open up, they're trying to decrease their negative list for foreign investment. So that in the AmCham Business Climate Survey, there's an expectation that the market will continue to open up here.
How well prepared are foreign companies, in your view, to deal with the new corporate social credit system? Do you believe that the corporate social credit system will ultimately serve as a level playing field between Chinese and foreign companies?
That's a great question, Dave. So most people who are interested in China have heard about the social credit system at the individual level. And you hear about this, for example, I was on the high-speed train recently, and you heard announcements that if you don't obey the rules, your name's going to go on this blacklist on the social credit system, and you won't be able to ride the high-speed train. So it's affecting individuals, but there's also a corporate version of that. And I would say for a lot of companies I talk to, it's not very much in the center of their radar. They hear about it, they know it's coming. The big concern is the uncertainty over what it will mean. And if you run afoul of some of the requirements of any one department, the punishments get multiplied across multiple departments. For example, if you have a problem with the tax department, you may get negative repercussions from the Finance Bureau, from Labor Bureau, from other bureaus. So companies that look at this and really worry about compliance, most multinationals worry a lot about how do you comply with laws and regulations, look at this and really try to figure out how are they going to comply. Some of the unknowns about it, for example, if you have a financial controller in your company and his personal social credit rating is not good, that then affects your corporate social credit rating. So the companies are saying, wait a minute, we don't want to get into the personal affairs of all of our employees. And yet that can potentially have a negative effect on their company's ability to face, for example, to get a bank loan. So there's still a lot of uncertainty about how this will roll out and what the practical implications will be. But China is moving in this direction to try and have a fairer, more consistent, and create a more trusting environment for transactions, company transactions.
We're already nearing the end of the webinar, so I'd like to zoom out again and look at the big picture once more. China's economic center of gravity has continued to shift southwards for some time now, particularly driven by the clusters in the Yangtze River Delta and the Pearl River Delta. So my question would be, should foreign companies looking to set up a China headquarter increasingly choose Shenzhen over Beijing?
If you look at most American companies, I live in Beijing, so maybe I have a Beijing bias, but I would say most companies you will see setting up headquarters in Shanghai, some in Shenzhen, but most in the Yangtze River Delta area. That seems to be, for American companies at least, place they're most comfortable. Particular industries will set up in Beijing, sometimes financial companies because being close to the regulators. But even many of them, most of their biggest operations are in Shanghai, where you have the stock market and much more commercial activity. So yeah, China's worried about this, continued emphasis on the disparity between the East Coast and the West. So again, if you go into the 14th five-year plan, you will see that there are policies and projections and hopes to see a more even development throughout China. For example, Guizhou province in Western China is a very poor province, but China's made it a center for big data operations. So Apple, for example, has its data center in Guizhou province. So China is trying to actively to even out the economic growth in China, but it's still in some of these traditional areas of the Pearl River Delta down near Shenzhen and Guangzhou, and then the Yangtze River Delta, Shanghai to Nanjing.
At the same time, Hong Kong remains China's international financial center. I think despite the pandemic, Hong Kong actually had a very good 2020. I mean, in terms of the financial hub. How do you see the future of Hong Kong as international financial center and as a base for foreign companies to access the China market?
I think that's still a really big open question. Hong Kong's been in the news a lot for a whole variety of reasons recently. I think China's saying that Hong Kong's going to do better under some of the changes that have been made. I think people are taking a wait and see attitude. Hong Kong has been a very good place to operate from, both for China and for Asia. And I hope that continues to be true.
We are running out of time, but I know that you are an avid skier, Mike, so I have to ask you one question about the upcoming Beijing Winter Olympics, which are now less than a year away. Is sports in general, and maybe winter sports in particular, an attractive industry for foreign companies in China?
I think so. I've been to 2 out of the 3 Winter Olympic competition sites in the last couple of years. I see hundreds of Chinese primary school, secondary, college students learning how to ski. I've gone to a winter sports exhibition here in Beijing that was just flooded with companies, both international and Chinese, and as well as people looking around and trying out different kinds of winter sports equipment. So I think it is an area. My last ski trip, I met instructors from Norway and Sweden who had 3-year contracts here in China. So that it's definitely developing.
Fantastic. With that, I would like to thank you very much, Mike, for your time and for sharing your insights with us. Thank you, Mike.
Thanks, David. I'm really looking forward to an in-person STARS China meeting in the not too distant future. And thanks for organizing today.
It was insightful and fun as always. I would also like to thank all our alumni who participated in today's webinar. In the next STARS webinar on the 16th of April, we talk with the co-founders of BioNTech, Professor Dr. Hugo Shahin and Dr. Özlem Türeci, about how they succeeded in developing the world's first vaccine against COVID-19 and what their scientific breakthrough in messenger RNA technology means for the future of health. I hope to see you there. In the meantime, take care and stay healthy. Thank you and goodbye.